Hi, it's Brendan here. Before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to let you know about our next online event, the last one of the year. The wonderful James Dreyfus, star of Gimme 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 and Absolutely Fabulous, will be joining me for an extra festive live recording of The Brendan O'Neill Show. You can join us on Zoom on Wednesday, the 18th of December at 7 p.m. UK time. We'll be discussing some of this past year's maddest moments in the culture war, what derangements might be in store in 2025, and James will be answering your questions too. The event is free and exclusive for Spike supporters, so if you're a member, then register for your ticket now via the supporters hub or by going to spiked-online.com/events. If you're not a supporter, then why not sign up today? For just £5 or more per month, you can get access to this event, plus all the exciting events we have planned in the new year, alongside loads of other perks too. Sign up today at spiked-online.com/support. We even have a special Christmas offer for you. If you donate £50 or more per year, you'll get a year's membership of Spike supporters, and we'll throw in a Spiked mug for UK addresses only. So if you want the mug, the membership, and a place at this event, then go to spiked-online.com/donate. I can't wait to see you all on Wednesday, the 18th of December at 7 p.m. Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Jonathan Turley. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Brendan. Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you on, and let's talk about your new book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. There's so much in this book. Everyone who is a fan of free speech or concerned about the fate of freedom of speech should definitely read this book. There's lots in there about the history of this idea, the enactment of this idea, where it might go in the future. There is so much to chew over. But I guess I want to kick off by asking you about the title itself, and especially about that descriptor, The Age of Rage. So when I first saw the title of the book, I thought, oh, this will be about our new era of Twitter fighting and polarization and algorithms and constant arguing on the internet. I thought that would be the age of rage you were referring to. But actually, you see it as an era that is a bit longer than that. And the age of rage has a bit more history to it. So could you kick off by explaining to us what you mean by an age of rage and why you thought it was important to locate freedom of speech within that particular idea?
I'd be happy to do that, Brendan. I think it's actually a good place to begin because this isn't our first age of rage. That's why the subtitle is An Age of Rage rather than The Age of Rage. The book is an effort to understand what free speech is from the personalities and periods that we have lived through, going back to Great Britain, going back before the Revolution. And that history is marked by periods of rage where you have rage rhetoric. This country was formed, was born in an age of rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was an act of rage. And what the book tries to explore is how rage rhetoric, as I refer to it, becomes state rage, that governments use that rhetoric to crack down on citizens, to impose censorship, blacklisting, to arrest thousands, as was done in the United States. The fact is, the United States is not as good as our advertising. I mean, we have really gone through terrible periods where we have arrested thousands, communists, socialists, feminists, unionists. All of this was an act, in my view, of state rage. And one thing the book tries to explore, and this is why it took me 30 years to write this book, is that we're still struggling with what free speech is. We're still on this slippery slope and trying to understand what this concept is. All of us seem to agree it's indispensable. We can't agree about why it's indispensable.
Yeah, I really want to get to that point because I think that is such an important point, and I think your book does an excellent job of explaining why freedom of speech is more than just a useful tool. It's something far more profound than that. So I want to kind of get us towards that view. But to begin with, let's talk a little bit about the history of it. So the history of this idea, the history of the notion of freedom of speech. Your book has a lot of history in there. You talk a lot about the US, of course, and the First Amendment. You also talk about the British context, which is something that I'm interested in, and many of my listeners will be interested in too. And it's what I found interesting is that you quote from old English documents that were essentially clampdowns on freedom of speech. So you quote from the Statute of Westminster in 1275, and it's such an interesting line where it says, "From henceforth, none be so hardy as to tell or publish any false news or tales that might sow discord between the king and his people." And I read that and I thought, well, there you go. It's the misinformation idea, but 800 years ago. And I wanted to ask you how common are the themes of censorship? Because you look back to that era prior to the English Revolution, prior to the English Civil War, prior to our Bill of Rights, when we did develop the idea of freedom of speech, when there were these clampdowns that were often justified on the basis of stopping misinformation or preventing seditious thinking. And you do see those ideas coming back today, don't you, in the new forms of censorship that we face in the 21st century?
You certainly do. And to understand free speech, I go all the way back to ancient Greece, but it's really our relationship with Great Britain that is so interesting and profound because, in many respects, the most revolutionary act of the American Revolution was how we approach free speech. It was the most significant break from Great Britain. Free speech had not really taken deep roots in Great Britain, as was reflected by the Statute of Westminster in 1275. The interesting aspect about that history is that many people are familiar with the Star Chamber. What they're not familiar with is that the Star Chamber was actually a speech prosecution forum, that it was created because English courts really began to question whether they could convict people of treason for telling bawdy jokes about the Queen or telling tales against the Crown. And the response of the Crown was to create a new court and a new crime, and the crime was sedition. So it was sort of like treason light, and it was an effort to create a new court, a new crime where they could prosecute people for saying things that were obnoxious to the crown. And so that history really informed the view of the framers when they eventually embodied our concept of free speech in the First Amendment. And the interesting thing about that is that it was incredibly revolutionary then. It's revolutionary now. I mean, one of my colleagues is leading an effort in the United States to amend the First Amendment. She believes that the First Amendment is, quote, aggressively individualistic, and she has language to balance free speech against equity. Well, that's what actually is happening in Europe. I mean, free speech is in a free fall in Europe, including in Great Britain. And what we have to sort of think about is which path we want to go down. And that wave has reached our shores in the United States. We have had an anti-free speech movement in Europe that's been building for years. But we also have our homegrown anti-free speech movement that came from higher education, and it's now metastasized among the media and government and corporations. And we're not going to be able to resolve this conflict unless we can resolve what free speech is, why it is it's indispensable, and what you need to defend it.
Absolutely. And I wanted to press you a bit more on the relationship between Britain and America when it comes to the development of the modern notion of freedom of speech and how we understand it today. And you talked just there about how one of the things that the early Americans wanted to do was to distance themselves from some of the censorship that ruled in Britain in the right up to the 1600s and after that too, in fact. And you make the point in your book that the Bill of Rights that we got here in 1689 tended to protect the freedom to speak in Parliament, but not so much the freedom to speak in public. So there was a kind of a disparity there. And you also tell the story of one of my heroes, John Lilburne, also known as Freeborn John, who was a leveller during the English Civil War, and he was a smuggler of seditious pamphlets into Britain, for which he was publicly flogged and punished. And it's a story that's fairly well known in the annals of the history of freedom. So was it the case that the founders of modern America, the early revolutionaries, they looked at that history and they said, well, there are things we can learn from the mother country, but there are definitely things we want to do differently. Is that how they conceived of creating this new country that would be founded very explicitly in the ideals of freedom?
Yes, I think, Brendan, I think that's quite accurate. When you look at the American Revolution, we took much from Great Britain. I mean, the framers had great attachment and affection for many aspects of Great Britain, including English laws. I mean, the English common law, of course, became the foundation of American common law. And we have always had this close affiliation to the present day as two common law nations committed to many of the same values. It was on free speech that the framers saw the greatest disconnect. The framers were heavily influenced by philosophers like John Locke. They believed that there were certain rights that were natural rights that belonged to us as human beings, that were not the creation or the gift of the government. Rather, the government was supposed to protect those natural rights that were gifts from God, that were part of being fully human. And while the framers did not subscribe to the British view of free speech, they did take a great deal from many of the writers in Great Britain. And as you noted, Freeborn John, John Lilburne is a great example of that. George Bernard Shaw said that unreasonable people are people who expect the world to conform to them. And he then added, that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. And Freeborn John was the ultimate unreasonable person. He defied the Star Chamber. He was pulled before the Star Chamber. Imagine that. I mean, he's pulled before this fearsome chamber where you have virtually no rights. The laws are cut and dry against you. And he defied them. Ultimately, he was tied to the back of an ox cart and flogged from Fleet Prison to Palace Yard. He was dragged that entire distance. He was pilloried in Palace Yard. And even in that state, he continued to protest. He continued to yell and lecture the crowd about free speech and the abuses of the crown. So he was gagged. And even when he was gagged, he continued to stamp his feet in protest to the point that they just gave up. They just took him to his cell because there was nothing that could break Freeborn John. I obviously have a great deal of admiration for some of these personalities, particularly Lilburne, because it shows who our true heroes are. Part of the thing this book does is it tries to identify not just who our heroes are, but who are sort of our fallen angels. I would rather my children learn about Freeborn John than John Adams. I mean, John Adams was an incredible hypocrite. He became everything he despised in the British. And the book sort of suggests that our true heroes are people like Freeborn John, that really put themselves, their lives, in the path of state rage.
In relation to that, just looking at the American context and the development of the idea of freedom of speech there, one thing that I found quite surprising in your book is that, and some of the reviewers have commented on this, is that you talk about the First Amendment in great detail, of course, and the First Amendment, as listeners will know, is the much admired commitment in the US to forbidding the state from interfering with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the freedom to worship. And you've mentioned earlier on in this conversation that has been, the United States has not always lived up to that ideal, to that First Amendment, through its arrest of communists and feminists and other supposed social and political deviants over the decades. But you talk in the book about how the very ideals of the First Amendment were undermined by governments in the US quite early on, quite soon after these amendments were adopted. And in the book, you talk about the sedition addiction of governments, where they are addicted to this idea that they must hunt out for seditious thinking and seditious ideas. And you talk about the passing of the Sedition Act in the US and the impact that had on this new freedom of speech. Can you talk a little bit about Why do you think freedom of speech was caveated or checked or balanced so soon in the American experience?
Well, that's one of the great tragedies of the American Revolution. We had this moment of clarity at the Revolution. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't mention democracy once. It talks about liberty. And it talks about liberty as a natural right. It has a very Lockean feel to it. And when it came to free speech, that was really captured in the First Amendment. And we had that moment of clarity that was then lost within a few years as Federalist judges defaulted to the more Blackstonian British view of free speech. They adopted what I call a functionalist view, that the idea is that you protect free speech to the degree that it perfects or advances democracy, that it's protected because it's needed for democracy. And it certainly is needed for democracy, but it's much more than that. And what the book suggests is that it's a human right. It's necessary to make us fully human. But what happened in those years is that we regressed back to the Blackstonian view, and that opened up the door for the Adams administration to use the Alien and Sedition Acts to prosecute his political opponents. And what was most notable during this period I talk about is that even Jefferson himself, who pardoned many of those convicted, or all of them actually convicted under the Adams administration, he also would prosecute people for their political views, not to the same extent, but he also failed that standard. The person who didn't, in my view, is James Madison, and he wrote a famous report known as the Report of 1800. And I was really taken how in that report he refers to sedition as a monster. And that captivated me because I think it really does capture what sedition is, what speech prosecutions are. They are this monster that lives within us, that we release upon each other when we're very afraid or we're very angry. And this monster comes out in our ages of rage. And Madison really sort of captured that and said that we have to break this pattern, to break what I call the sedition addiction. We've never done that. It was interesting that one of the first things the Department of Justice did after January 6th is that they pursued, a handful of people, not just for the riot, but charged them with seditious conspiracy. And it's still there. We still want to create crimes that are speech-based as opposed to conduct-based, which is what the book tries to suggest, is that we have to move away from prosecution of speech and focus on conduct.
Yes, and I want to ask you about the January 6th issue in a moment, but I think first I want to just touch on some of the ways in which, because I feel that we live in an incredibly censorious culture in 2024, sadly, and you touch on a lot of this in your book and in your writings over the years as well, in fact. And I'm very interested, and even more so since reading your book, about the way in which old notions of problematic speech are continually rehabilitated, sometimes in slightly different language, sometimes in more politically correct forms. But all those ideas that were there in England and America hundreds of years ago about the danger of seditious speech, the danger of libeling important people and monarchs and peers, the danger of disinformation or false news or false rumours, all of those ideas seem to be coming back to life in the modern era in a very powerful way. And I wanted to touch on one of them in particular, which is this idea of misinformation or disinformation. I know there's a slight difference between those things. You've been called out. The New York Times, in its review of your book, called you out for your lack of concern about the supposed scourge of misinformation. Papers like the New York Times and other so-called liberal outlets are very concerned with misinformation and with their supposed right to tell us what is true and what is false. Talk to us a little bit about why you see the idea of misinformation as potentially problematic, in the sense that, I guess, crusades against misinformation, especially if they come from the state, can often have the impact of undermining freedom of thought and freedom of speech.
Well, I actually thought that the New York Times review was rather humorous. First of all, there was no evidence that the author actually read the book. If you read the things, I mean, it was a curious review because he said, the problem with his book is that he really makes this huge case for free speech and doesn't embrace censorship. And I was like, well, yeah, that's sort of the point of the book, but. It was also funny because the book actually criticizes the New York Times more than any other paper in the United States, which they also didn't mention. But the Biden administration has said there are three categories for censorship. You've got disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Of the three, malinformation is my favorite because it's defined by the Biden administration as the use of true facts in a misleading way. It's hard to imagine how the government might abuse that standard, right? I mean, every government has argued in history that people are using facts in misleading ways, but here you have people saying, well, that also has to be censored or moderated. And the whole idea is that we have to protect people from dangerous thoughts. We've got to sort of put them in this framing so that they can have good thoughts. And that's been the sort of clarion's cry or the siren's cry uh, for centuries. And the question is really when we face these anti-free speech advocates, how we present our arguments, right? Because they tend to want us to fight on their ground. First of all, they tend to make arguments that, in my view, are really disingenuous. They'll bring up things like child pornography. This came up in sort of a debate I had with one of the top Facebook people. And I mentioned, look, child pornography is against the law. It's an act. It's a criminal act. No one's talking about child pornography here. But what they'll do is they will take the most extreme forms of conduct, but then justify this ambiguous, sweeping, and fluid standard of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And we really see how that has taken hold in Europe. I'm an Anglophile. I love Great Britain. I spend much of my research on British sources, and it breaks my heart to see what has happened to free speech in Great Britain. I find it just unimaginable how it has been allowed to go this far. But if you take a look at Great Britain, France, Germany, Canada, you can see what happens when you allow for censorship to take hold. It becomes this insatiable appetite. If you're censoring this group, well, how about that group? How about if you're saying this is a grotesque or offensive concept, how about this concept that I find offensive? And so politicians pile on, and the scope of the censorship grows. That's always been the lesson of history. One of the things the book raises is name a single censorship system in history that has worked, that has actually stopped a single idea or a single movement. It has a perfect failure record. And this book tries to explain why. And it's because, in my view, free speech is a human right. It is something that we're hardwired for. I even talk about medical studies showing that if you don't express yourself, you could physically change. Parts of your brain shrink. That we are so designed for free speech that we can have a physical response to the failure or the inability to use it. And that's the reason censorship systems have always failed, because free speech is like water. It finds its way out because we need it to be human. And so what it does, the success is not in stopping any particular idea. If you take a look at Germany, they have been doing robust censorship, particularly since World War II, even before then, but since World War II. And I spoke to a group of academics, including many German academics and judges, and I asked them, how is it working for you? Right? You've been at this longer than anyone. And yet you have robust parades. You've got these massive parades and demonstrations of thousands of skinheads and Nazis in your street, right? But you have a poll recently that showed only 17% of Germans feel comfortable speaking their values in public, right? So you've succeeded in silencing the wrong group, right? The neo-Nazis are doing great, right? But the rest of your population is afraid to speak. But of course, for government officials, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because censorship is about power, right? The fact that people have this chilling effect, that they have this self-censorship, is precisely what officials want.
That's very well put. And in relation to the self-censorship question, I wanted to ask you, because another idea, alongside misinformation and malinformation and those old notions that have been repackaged in new ways, the other idea that we've seen grow enormously over the past few decades is the idea of speech as harmful to the individual. It might shatter your self-esteem if you hear a disagreeable idea. You might feel erased. You might feel your identity being erased if someone calls it into question. There is this idea that speech is very, very harmful to the individual. And to me, it kind of echoes older ideas about speech as a kind of moral pollutant. The pollution of men's souls with heresy or rumors or whatever else it might be. This notion that speech is something that can get into the soul of a person and blow it up, and therefore speech has to be controlled. And we see this idea particularly on campuses. We've seen it in campuses in the US and in the UK, where students have devoted themselves in recent times to censoring all sorts of things that they consider to be harmful to their mental well-being or their self-esteem. I've found myself being no platformed from Oxford University in the UK, and lots of other people too have been expelled from campuses because their ideas are seen as harmful. How do you counter that idea that speech is harmful without at the same time without selling out the idea that speech is actually powerful? It is a very powerful tool, but the idea that it's harmful and will destroy the individual is a pretty dangerous one, isn't it?
It is. And of course, we have the same phenomenon that you described, Brendan, in the United States. In the Indispensable Right, I have a whole chapter on higher education, where, of course, we have cancel campaigns and deplatforming here. And we're also raising a generation of speech phobics, kids who have been told since they were in grade school that speech is harmful, that you should not be triggered by opposing views. And, when I went to University of Chicago, I lived in a vegetarian cooperative called the Dorchester Cooperative. It's where the book The Jungle was written. And downstairs, we had Trotskyites that would meet in the basement, and upstairs we had militant vegans. Next door, we had socialists, and on the other side, we had libertarians. I thought they were all crazy at the time, but I couldn't get enough of them. I was fascinated by them. I loved every minute of it. It was a true awakening for me in college. I was able to talk to people that saw what I was seeing, but saw something so very different, and I wanted to know why. And it was a wonderful, wonderful education. Kids don't have that today. We have largely purged faculties of conservatives, libertarians, dissenters. It has become an academic echo chamber. That's one of the reasons I adored the late University of Chicago president, Robert Zimmer. He sent out a letter that congratulated students for getting accepted at University of Chicago. And, Chicago takes less than 5% of applicants. So these kids had really worked really hard, and he congratulated them. And he then said, what, I want to make sure you understand that many of you are concerned that you will come here and there'll be no safe spaces, and that you're going to find views that are threatening to you. And I just want to assure you that at the University of Chicago, there are no safe spaces. He said, if you want safe spaces, you need to go somewhere else, because we won't protect you from ideas here. And it became known as the Chicago letter, and it has been adopted by some universities. It was a brilliant letter. But it was an island in this raging sea of censorship and orthodoxy in higher education. And believe me, higher education will be the final and last hardened silo if we can regain ground for free speech. There is no evidence that my colleagues at my school or other schools are seriously reconsidering their creation of this orthodox and tolerant environment. I just had a debate at Harvard Law School on free speech. And I raised with Randall Kennedy, who's a law professor there, who was on the other side. that Harvard has less than 8% of its faculty self-identify as conservative or Republican. And I said, this is a country where there's a slightly over majority of conservative, Republican, libertarian citizens. And you're at 8%. And Randall Kennedy said, well, we're an elite university. We don't have to look like America. And I responded to, you don't even look like Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts is over 30% Republican. You don't even look like Boston. I mean, Boston is about 22% Republican. But the point is that there is no sense of responsibility of faculty to create a diversity of viewpoints on their campuses. To the contrary, it works to their advantage. It works to their advantage to have colleagues that won't disagree with them. It works to their advantage to have publications that only run pieces from their viewpoint. And even though the institution suffers, and certainly the students suffer, that self-interest is going to continue to guide higher education until donors say, enough, I'm not going to give you any money. There are departments that don't have a single conservative or Republican, according to self-surveys across the country. And eventually donors are going to say, why am I giving you money when you replicate your own views like this?
Hi, it's Brendan here. I want to let you know some exciting news. My new book is out now. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in chilling detail how activists, academics, and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up, in the process, turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now on Amazon.
And in your chapter on higher education, it's an excellent chapter, and you talk about the university. You say that what was once a protected space for viewpoint diversity has become a place for enforced orthodoxy. And you make the point that those who are accused of harmful speech can be stripped of every cherished aspect of an intellectual life, including, in some cases, their actual academic position in the university itself. But I wanted to ask you about those cherished aspects of intellectual life, or what used to be the cherished aspects of intellectual life, and what people lose when there is this culture of policing so-called harmful speech. Because it seems to me the fact, you say that the university will be the last silo if we ever do, push the scales towards favouring freedom of speech. They will cling to censorship probably for longer than anyone else. But talk a little bit about what you think is lost, especially in the university, which ought surely to be a site of intellectual experimentation and risk-taking. What is lost when there is this stifling culture, or this culture of conformism, and this culture of self-policing because people don't want to be seen to be saying the wrong thing? It seems to me that all of that runs entirely counter to the whole mission of a university.
It certainly does. And it is unforgivable what we have done to not just our institutions, but to our students. We have denied them the education that we had. And in my view, it truly is inexcusable. And it has changed not just the students and how they are learning. It's changed the faculty. Most faculty members have remained silent as their colleagues have been investigated and coerced and canceled and deplatformed. The silence is deafening. People will write to me on my blog to give me things happening at the university. And I often say, why don't you write about this? And they're very honest. And they say, I can't afford to lose my job. And what people don't understand, and I talk about this in the Indispensable Right, because I talk in the book about people like Mike Adams, is that what happens is that these cancel campaigns are vicious. They take away from you everything that brings meaning to you as an intellectual. I've only wanted to be a teacher my whole life. I consider it one of the great honors of my life to be able to teach students. And people don't understand what these cancel campaigns do. They take away everything that means anything to an intellectual. They take away publication opportunities. They take away speaking opportunities. They take away classes. In some cases, they take away your job. That's what happened to Dr. Mike Adams. He was a professor of sociology and criminology in North Carolina. He was also a conservative. And because of that, he was hit repeatedly with investigations and suspensions for saying things that were conservative. And he had to go to court repeatedly to keep his job. And then one day, after all they had gone through the courts and he was again back teaching, he made some dumb joke on social media, which, by the way, he removed and apologized for very quickly. But of course, the university said, okay, well, you're under investigation again, and we were looking at suspension. And they had finally worn him down, and they got him to agree to a settlement to leave teaching. And shortly before that day came, just a couple of days before, he went home and he blew his brains out. And what I say in the book is, it's hard to obviously understand when people are in that state and when they take such action. But I sort of understand what he was going through. I mean, he was a day or so away from no longer being the only person he ever wanted to be, that he was no longer going to be an academic. He was no longer going to be a teacher. And he couldn't see anything beyond that point. And in many ways, it captures the viciousness of this movement, how it just strangles the life out of education and out of educators. It's going to take a long time for us to restore this, but there's no evidence that we're making serious inroads. The AAUP, which is the Organization of University Law Professors, just selected a president who is one of these sort of woke warriors and has pledged that they're going to continue to be part of the resistance and sort of replicate what has happened before. And once again, the only possible way that we are going to reverse this is if donors join these dissenters and say, we're not going to support your university. That's the only thing that will happen. And we see that it can happen. We see universities like Columbia, Harvard, they really got knocked back a step when donors started to say, you're not going to get my money.
It's, reading that section of your book and other sections of the book too, I was really struck just by, the sheer cruelty of censorship. And people will often say these days that freedom of speech is a risky business, it's dangerous, it can unleash problematic ideas and so on. But, there's nothing more dangerous than censorship in terms of the threat it poses to the human condition itself. And that story you've just recounted there is a good example of just how threatening censorship can be to a person's life and their view of themselves. I want to touch on a part of the book that I think is probably one of the most controversial parts of the book, and certainly that New York Times review, let's not dwell on that review, but that review didn't like it very much. And this is a really interesting chapter towards the end of the book, which is about January 6th and the revival of American sedition. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. You make it so clear in that chapter that the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021 was a disgrace, as you describe it. And you say you sat there open-mouthed watching people storm the Capitol, and it was awful. But then you talk about how the January 6th, the fallout from it, then became another way in which the culture of censorship got boosted and even further empowered. And you talk about that in two ways, really. Firstly, the way in which the woke left came to dominate the language that you were allowed to use around the January 6th. So even calling it a riot became problematic. You had to call it an insurrection. Otherwise, you risked being branded an apologist and someone who was playing it down. So they really had a tight rein on the language itself that one was allowed to use. But also, you then talk about the resuscitation of the idea of sedition, and, as you call it, the revival of American sedition, and the idea of seditious conspiracy, and the fact that some people were charged with that particular offence. So could you just talk a bit about what you think happened after January 6th, and how it really helped to boost some of these problematic ideas that you discuss in the book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period, but it's not an unfamiliar period. In many ways, it repeated the cycle that the book talks about in terms of state rage. You know, the Department of Justice lead prosecutor announced that he was going to bring forth what he called shock and awe, that he was going to hit these defendants so hard that no one would ever think of coming to Washington to do anything like this again. And so they arrested hundreds of people. The fact is that virtually all of them were charged with relatively minor crimes, so things like trespass, unauthorized entry. The more serious ones would be property damage. There was only a handful that were charged actually with seditious conspiracy, which, by the way, can include just obstructing official proceedings. You know, so it's the world's broadest type of defined crime. It goes back like the Star Chamber. It's a crime that is designed to make it almost impossible for people to challenge its scope. And, you know, the fact is that, you know, I was doing the coverage, helping contributing to the coverage on January 6th. I criticized Trump's speech on the air while he was still giving it. And to me, it was a desecration of our constitutional process. But the next day, when this insurrection mantra started in the media, I wrote a piece saying, this is not an insurrection. We know what insurrections are. This is a riot. It's a protest that got out of control and became a riot. Just like, by the way, protests at the White House from the left became a riot. And more officers were injured outside the White House than were injured on Capitol Hill. And both were inexcusable. There was a total collapse of security at the Congress, and we're just now exploring how that happened. But the minute you question the use of insurrection, you are put on this list of dissenters. And the fact is, polls show that the public does not view this as an insurrection. That polls have shown that the public view it as a riot. And I think that this was a mantra in the media, in academia, in politics. But time and time again, the American public has shown a remarkable common sense. You know, the vast majority of us are appalled by what happened on January 6th. That was our capital. That was our constitutional process. And there are very few people that defend what happened in that riot. But the American people also see it for what it was. You know, we watched it. When I was doing the coverage, I noted that I'd never seen such light security in such a major protest. I mean, our cameras were showing in some cases major entry points with 4 or 5 bicycle cops trying to block these roads. It made no sense at all because the National Guard had just been called out not long before to stop the riot at the White House, and Trump had to be taken to a secure location. But they called out the National Guard, they put up fencing, and it stopped. That same approach was offered to Congress, and there's still an investigation going on why it was declined. But the fact is that the security perimeter collapsed very quickly, and it unleashed this rush into the Capitol. And all of that is really horrible, but it's not an insurrection. But it really does, as you note, and we explore this in the Indispensable Right, is once again, this was state rage. That you had rage rhetoric on January 6th, and then it immediately became state rage as they arrested hundreds, and people were, canceled or blacklisted if they didn't use the term insurrection. The National Public Radio and other, and the AP particularly recently, still uses the term. They still, as a matter of news, as fact, refer to January 6th as insurrection, even though very few people do that. Including most of the media has started has gone back to referring to it as a riot. But it shows how this orthodoxy is still has this hold on our dialogue and our debate.
That term state rage that you use, I think is such a helpful term. And it really connected with me. And, not only in the US context, but if we look at the British context and the European context, there is very clear instances of state rage where the state clamps down pretty viciously on speech that it considers harmful or untrue or problematic in some way. Listeners will be familiar with the recent case of police in Britain visiting a journalist, Alison Pearson, to interrogate her about some tweet she wrote a year ago. There have been many such cases in the UK of people being, talked to and sometimes arrested by the police for things they write online. And just after the riots we had in England a few months ago, people were actually imprisoned, not for taking part, some for taking part in the riots, but some for things they wrote on Facebook and Twitter while the riots were taking place. So there are very clear cases of, that may well have been street rage from ordinary people, but then it's responded to with this state rage. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between that state rage and then just a broader culture of self-policing, because people will sometimes say, well, there are fewer state laws against speech than there were in the past, or the state doesn't quite put the boot on the neck in the way that it might have done 100 years ago or 400 years ago if you say something that's heretical or blasphemous or whatever else it might be. And there's truth in that, of course. But it does seem to me that there is a relationship between this message that the state and the media classes sends about dangerous speech and the trickle-down impact that it has on people's willingness to express themselves. And, I often think of the case of J.K. Rowling, for example, who speaks out very forthrightly on the issue of transgenderism and women's rights, and people try to cancel her, but she's uncancelable. But the impact of the demonization of her, of course, is that it sends a signal to women who are less culturally influential than she is, less rich, less powerful. It sends a message to them saying, well, you better not express your gender critical views because imagine what will happen to you.
Yeah, I think J.K. Rowling, in many respects, is the sort of Elon Musk of the UK. I mean, they finally this irresistible force found an unmovable object, and she has taken a lot of heat. And I've written a great deal about her because I think that you're absolutely right that this was a quintessential fight on free speech, and she has held the line to a degree that very few people are willing to do it, because the whole idea of state rage is not really to arrest everyone with ideas you don't want to be heard, right? The idea is that you make examples of people so that the vast majority self-censor. And there's an example in the Indispensable Right, where I talk about one UK case involving a guy who, quite frankly, was a bit of a loser, more than a little bit. I mean, he was sort of a horrible guy. He had rooms filled with all types of horrible stuff, racist, anti-Semitic stuff. It was like a hate, altar. And he was ultimately arrested. Now, this was a guy who was not arrested for any conduct that I could see. He was arrested because of the contents of that room, his viewpoints. And the court upheld his conviction for what was described as toxic ideologies. And this concept of toxic ideology is an amazingly dangerous concept because it easily can become a sort of thought crime. You are allowed to bunker yourself in this hate-filled room of yours and surround yourself with these horrible images and material. What society's interest is to prevent you from engaging in conduct, not holding toxic ideologies or even expressing toxic ideologies. But once you start to uphold convictions of people like that, it sends the message. And that's one of the reasons why in Germany, only 17% of people feel comfortable speaking publicly, right? When I spoke to this one group, I said, in Germany, you just arrested a guy because he had a Hitler ringtone on his phone. Now, what did that really achieve? Right? How did that work out for you? And the answer is it achieved nothing, obviously, but it sent a message to everyone else. that even your ringtone can result in your being arrested. And that chilling effect is exactly what the state wants.
Yeah, very well put. Okay, Jonathan, just a couple more questions for you. One of the things I appreciated most about your book, because this is a thought I've had many times over the years, and you put it incredibly well, and you've mentioned it already, which is that very often these days free speech is defended as a functional thing, something that's helpful, I guess is how some people would understand it. Free speech is useful because it makes it easier to have a democracy because you can share political ideas, or it's, some people will argue, even people who are very much on the side of freedom of speech will make the argument that, well, it helps to drain tensions from society, it helps to drain conflict from society, therefore it's a useful pacifying tool. That's one of the arguments we hear a lot these days as well. These very functional treatments of freedom of speech, and you make a much more profound philosophical point, which is that freedom of speech is actually the very essence of being human. It is what makes us human, and you kind of push back against this overly functional treatment of this incredibly important human virtue. So could you explain a little bit about why you thought it was important to do that?
Well, what the book begins with is an effort to drill down on this concept of where does it come from? I mean, there's two different views, right? One is it comes from the government. That's more of a positivist view, that the government allows for free speech because it achieves so much good in a democracy. The other possibility, which is the one I subscribe to, is that it's a natural right. It's an autonomous theory. It belongs to us because we can't be fully human without it. And we're surrounded by evidence of the truth of that, right? The very concept of a starving artist captures it. You have people like Van Gogh, who sold money that he needed to eat in order to buy canvas. Survival, sustaining yourself physically, is considered the most basic and overriding impulse of humanity. And yet here you've got artists, and he's not the only one, who were literally starving themselves so that they could project more of their visions into the society around them. It is that desire, it is that basic human impulse that the book tries to explore, that what the Indispensable Right sort of challenges the reader to do is to pick a side. If you believe that free speech is a human right, if you believe that it's an autonomous right that belongs to us, whether you believe it came from God or whether you believe it's just the fact that being human is to be able to express yourself, then that changes how we deal with conflicts. It moves the center of gravity closer to the individual. It makes it more difficult to make the trade-offs that we have made throughout our history. The reason I entitled this book The Indispensable Right is because that term came from an opinion written by a great civil libertarian, Justice Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis was a genius who saw individual rights years before the rest of the court was willing to accept. He could see a horizon that his colleagues could not imagine. And in this opinion, Whitney, he wrote beautifully about how this is our indispensable right. It's the right that guarantees all other rights. But in that opinion, he upheld the conviction of Charlotte Anita Whitney, a communist who was arrested for speaking against lynching. And what the title is meant to capture is that even Louis Brandeis, this great civil libertarian, in an opinion that wrote beautifully about the freedom of speech and it being indispensable, made it very much dispensable in the case of Whitney. He sent her off to jail for what is clearly political speech. And that's the problem, that unless you pick a side, unless you view this as an autonomous right, then these trade-offs continue and you will remain on that slippery slope where we are now.
Yeah. And that takes me very nicely onto my final question for you, which is about where we are now and where we might go next. So I'm asking you to get your crystal ball out and tell us what you think will happen in the future in relation to the indispensable right. And, when I was reading the closing chapter in the book, I think it's the closing chapter, it's towards the end of the book where you strike a slightly pessimistic note, to the extent, or I guess the aim is to alert the reader to how serious the problem is today. And you make the point that there have been many anti-free speech currents throughout history, but the one that we face today seems to have some uniquely dangerous elements to it. And you talk about the convergence of the academic, media, and corporate elites with government, all to the end of crushing speech in one way or another. And it's a very accurate description of the time we live in. But I wonder if you see things maybe improving in the near future. I wonder if you think the re-election of Donald Trump and the willingness of tens of millions of Americans to take a punt on this man who is not politically correct and who is willing to say things that you're not really supposed to say. And I wonder if you think, Elon Musk's takeover of X and all these other kinds of developments might possibly open up a space for more daring forms of thought and a kind of more certain defense of freedom of speech itself. Do you hold out hope that things will improve in the future?
Yeah, I actually view the book as hopeful. I was shocked. Weeks ago, I was speaking in Colorado, and this wonderful lady walked up and said, I read your book. I loved your book, but I was wondering if today, could you say something positive? And I was crushed. I was like, I honestly thought I was being positive, but it sort of made me feel like Woody Allen when at a speech, someone said, we'd really like you to end on a positive note. And Woody Allen reportedly said, I really don't do positive. Would you accept 2 negatives to make a positive? And I can't offer certainly 2 negatives to make a positive. And one is, it's not working. The fact is that we have this unprecedented alliance against free speech. We've never seen anything like this coalition of media, academia, corporations, the government. We've had corporations fund anti-free speech commercials. Facebook had this truly creepy commercial series in which they targeted young people and sort of invited them to celebrate what they called content moderation, a truly Orwellian term for censorship. And it didn't work. Yeah, they moved the needle a little bit, but it takes a lot more than that to get a free people to give up their freedom. And the fact is, I think that they did give up the ghost a bit. They're going back to old school. They're going back to Europe to get the, people like Hillary Clinton. When Musk took over Twitter, what was the first thing she seemed to do? She went to Europe and said, use the Digital Services Act to force Musk to censor Americans. It's old school, right? They're going back to the government just cracking down. They're going back to state rage. And that shows that they weren't able to convince enough people. And so I think that what you have is a movement that is going to continue to grow. But it gets to my second negative point, which is that it can't work as long as humans are still around. There's a certain optimism to the indispensable right that I think this nice person had missed.
Jonathan, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. And don't forget to register for your tickets for my live discussion with James Dreyfus on Wednesday, the 18th of December. And don't forget to donate to Spiked to get your hands on one of our excellent mugs. Find all the links in the show notes or by going to spiked-online.com.